The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, slicing through the suffocating tension that hung in the air. Henry Davenport, the arrogant billionaire who had grown accustomed to wielding his wealth to control the world, now trembled under the cold, piercing gaze of Judge Eleanor Vance. A historic moment had just been sealed when immense wealth and absolute power collided with unwavering justice. "Mr. Davenport, you do not stand above the law." Those words reverberated throughout the room, signaling the fall of an empire. Is this the end of the billionaire's arrogance, or merely the beginning of a legal battle full of shocking twists? Join us on this emotionally charged journey where dark secrets are revealed and justice is served. If you want to follow more emotional stories and valuable lessons like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video from Emotional Journey. A sleek black limousine glided to a halt in front of the federal courthouse. The door swung open, revealing a polished leather shoe stepping onto the pavement. The camera panned upwards, unveiling the figure of Henry Davenport, a middle-aged man in a perfectly tailored suit. His face was meticulously groomed, yet his eyes gleamed with an unmistakable air of arrogance and disdain. Henry Davenport entered the courtroom with an air of casual confidence, as if he were walking into a tea party rather than facing a trial. His gaze swept over the rows of polished wooden seats where reporters and onlookers watched his every move. He noticed a middle-aged woman with a hardened expression, her eyes burning with a fury that could scorch him. Henry smirked, accustomed to such hateful stares. He took a seat in the leather-clad chair, sinking into its luxurious comfort. Crossing his legs, he absently traced the outline of his diamond-encrusted watch, a gesture so unconscious, yet filled with contempt. He paid no attention to the whispers circulating around the room. Henry's world revolved around himself, his empire, the one he had painstakingly built. The courtroom, with its towering oak walls, grand stone columns, and the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of solemnity, seemed to leave him entirely indifferent. His eyes roamed the crowd of reporters who hung on his every gesture, as if they were mere pawns on his chessboard. There was something unsettling about the quiet tension in the room, an eerie calm before the storm. Henry, with his composed demeanor, was hiding a dark secret, and that secret, when revealed, would change everything. Henry Davenport was no stranger in the business world. He was a monument, a legend, a man who had built an empire from the ground up with his own two hands. Born into poverty and raised in a dilapidated slum, he refused to accept his fate. Driven by an insatiable desire to rise above his circumstances, he sought a way out of the squalor that defined his early years. He began his career hawking goods on the street, slowly expanding into various ventures. With a sharp mind, a visionary ability, and an audacious willingness to take risks, he climbed the ranks. He was not afraid to compete against the fiercest opponents, nor to confront uncertainty head-on. Through his sheer determination, he constructed a multinational conglomerate, employing thousands and raking in billions in revenue. He owned skyscrapers, luxury sports cars, and opulent yachts. He became a symbol of success, a role model for young entrepreneurs aspiring to follow in his footsteps. But behind the glittering facade lay darker corners of his world. Henry Davenport was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. He would crush competitors, deceive clients, and even break the law if it served his purpose. To him, money and power reigned supreme, while ethics and conscience held no place. His empire was built on the suffering of others, on corruption, and on inequality. He had created a world where he was king, where he ruled with an iron fist, and he believed that his wealth and power could buy anything, even escape from the consequences of his wrongdoings. But he was mistaken. He had underestimated the strength of justice, the power of human conscience. He had underestimated Judge Eleanor Vance, the steadfast and fair woman who would not allow anyone to stand above the law. Judge Eleanor Vance entered the courtroom without a hint of hesitation, unwavering and resolute. She was the embodiment of fairness, of justice. She was not merely a powerful woman. She was a woman of the law. Born and raised in a renowned family of lawyers, Eleanor Vance was introduced to the world of law from a young age. With a sharp intellect, an exceptional ability to analyze, and an unrelenting passion for justice, she excelled, graduating with honors from a prestigious law school. She quickly rose to become a talented attorney. But Eleanor Vance was more than just a brilliant lawyer. She was a woman with a deep sense of compassion. She was always concerned for the disadvantaged, those who suffered under the weight of injustice. She believed that the law must protect all individuals, regardless of wealth or status. With these qualities, Eleanor Vance swiftly ascended to the position of judge. Over the years, she presided over high-profile cases, from serious criminal trials to complex economic disputes. She consistently made fair rulings grounded in truth and the law. One particular case cemented Judge Eleanor Vance's reputation. It was a corruption trial involving a high-ranking official. Despite immense pressure from the government, Judge Vance remained steadfast, delivering a verdict that held the official accountable under the law. That case proved beyond doubt that Eleanor Vance was a woman who could not be bought, who could not be swayed. She was a symbol of integrity, of fairness. Now Henry Davenport, the arrogant billionaire, would have to face this formidable woman in the upcoming trial. The courtroom was heavy with silence, broken only by the rustling of lawyers' papers and the occasional clatter of keyboards. Henry Davenport, the arrogant billionaire, no longer wore his usual calm demeanor. He knew that the charges against him were far from simple, and this trial was not some game he could easily control. Henry Davenport faced a long list of accusations ranging from financial fraud and tax evasion to labor exploitation and environmental destruction. The prosecutors had gathered thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours of recordings, and testimonies from dozens of witnesses to expose his criminal actions. According to the indictment, Henry Davenport had used offshore shell companies to launder money, evade taxes, and hide massive profits. He had exploited workers in his factories, paying them meager wages, forcing them to work long hours, and failing to provide safe working conditions. He had also caused severe environmental damage, illegally dumping waste, and harming the health of local residents. The victims of Henry Davenport's actions were not just faceless numbers in financial reports. They were the impoverished laborers, drained to the bone by exploitation. They were the residents living near his factories, suffering from pollution and disease. They were the small businesses he crushed and absorbed into his empire. Among these victims was Mrs. Martha, a middle-aged woman with a weathered face and eyes filled with anger. Her husband, a factory worker in one of Davenport's plants, had died in a workplace accident. Martha had lost her husband, the father of her children, and her family had fallen into destitution. Then there was Mr. John, a small business owner who had been crushed by Henry Davenport's monopolistic tactics and driven to bankruptcy. Mr. John lost everything: his company, his home, his dignity. Reduced to homelessness, he now wandered the streets, a broken man with no place to call home. In a quiet corner of the courtroom, Mrs. Martha sat silently, her red-rimmed eyes fixed on Henry Davenport. She was not a beautiful woman, nor a wealthy one. She was simply a mother, a wife who had lost everything because of this arrogant billionaire. Her husband, Thomas, had been a skilled worker, dedicating 20 years of his life to Henry Davenport's factory. He was the pillar of their family, the man she loved more than anything. But then one fateful day, Thomas suffered a workplace accident in the factory. An old, poorly maintained machine crushed his arm. Henry Davenport, the man Thomas had devoted his life to, refused to compensate the family. He claimed Thomas had caused the accident himself, asserting that he was not responsible in any way. Thomas, with his mangled arm, could no longer work. The family fell into poverty, and then one day, Thomas could no longer bear the weight of it all. He took his own life. Mrs. Martha lost her husband, and their children lost their father. They lost everything. Across the courtroom, Mr. John sat huddled, trembling. He was not always homeless. He had once been a successful businessman, owning a small company that produced children's toys. His company had competed with one of Henry Davenport's subsidiaries. At first, everything was business as usual. But then Henry Davenport began to play dirty. He pressured suppliers to cut ties with Mr. John's company. He spread malicious rumors, tarnishing the company's reputation. Mr. John fought back, but how could he possibly stand up to a billionaire? His company went bankrupt, and he lost everything. Mr. John became homeless, wandering the streets. Mrs. Martha, Mr. John, and the hundreds of other victims were ordinary people whose lives had been ripped apart by Henry Davenport. They did not ask for much. They only wanted justice. They wanted Henry Davenport to answer for his cruel actions. Their stories were not just faceless statistics. They were shattered lives, wounds that could never truly heal. And now Henry Davenport, the arrogant billionaire, would have to face those pains in this trial. The courtroom doors slammed shut with a deafening thud, signaling the start of a battle with an unpredictable outcome. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the rustling of papers and the tense sighs filling the air. The dim light from above cast an oppressive shadow, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Every eye in the room was fixed on Sarah Collins, the prosecutor with sharp eyes standing firm in her place. Sarah could feel the coldness of Henry Davenport's gaze, the infamous tycoon who had built his empire through loopholes and corruption to protect his wealth. But this time, he had made a fatal mistake. Henry sat upright, his eyes seemingly piercing through every layer of truth. But Sarah knew well that he could not escape the light of justice. Each word Sarah spoke was delivered with resolve, even slightly gritted through clenched teeth, as if each syllable were a sharp blade cutting through the layers of deceit. This man built his empire through unlawful deeds, on the blood and sweat of the vulnerable, and now he must pay the price for his actions. On the other side, Henry Davenport's lawyer, a shrewd and cold figure, rose with a fabricated smile, skillfully countering every word Sarah said. We are talking about a successful man, a visionary. His decisions were strategic business moves, legal and sound. Prosecutor, can you prove beyond doubt that Mr. Davenport committed any crime? The lawyer's words struck at Sarah's mind like an arrow, but she remained unshaken. She knew that the truth always had a way of revealing itself, no matter how painful it might be. Every step she took was aimed at one goal: to make everyone see Henry Davenport for who he truly was. With every passing moment, the courtroom grew eerily silent. Each word, each event brought forth, opened deeper cracks in the defense wall Henry had so carefully constructed. Both sides fought relentlessly, not just for justice but for honor, for the things they held to be irreplaceable in life. The heated exchanges were more than just a confrontation between two sides. They were a battle between good and evil, light and darkness. Sarah felt the excruciating tension as though she were standing at a crossroads with only one choice before her: to follow the path of truth or leave everything behind. And then, as Sarah began to utter her final words, an overwhelming sense of suffocating intensity engulfed the room, marking the start of a battle that could not be undone. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock in the background. Judge Eleanor Vance entered the room, her sharp eyes sweeping across the space, never wavering for even a second. She was the only one in the room who could silence every noise, and the entire courtroom seemed to freeze in anticipation of her presence. Everyone rose immediately when the judge entered, a gesture showing respect for her position. However, in that moment, one glaring exception stood out. Henry Davenport, the arrogant billionaire, sitting with an air of defiance, a slight challenge in his eyes. He didn't move. He remained seated, arms crossed over his chest, his face as cold as stone, with no sign of acknowledging the power of the law. Judge Vance paused in the center of the room, her eyes as sharp as a blade locking onto Henry's. 1 second, 2 seconds. Time seemed to stretch in the suffocating tension. All eyes were on Henry, filled with surprise and anger. Yet there was only one person who remained unchanged: Henry, still sitting there, staring at the judge without bowing his head. Mr. Davenport, Judge Vance spoke, her voice like steel cutting through the silence. Do you intend to show disrespect for this courtroom? Henry slowly lifted his head, meeting her gaze without flinching. Respect? He sneered with a dismissive smile. What is the law if not a tool for those with power, like me, to control everything? I see no reason to stand when you enter. Each word from Henry struck like a hammer, leaving everyone in the courtroom stunned, mouths agape. This was an outright challenge, an act of contempt not only for Judge Vance, but for the entire legal system she represented. Judge Vance didn't give him the chance to continue. She walked toward her seat, her calm yet powerful voice filling the room, leaving no doubt about her authority. Mr. Davenport, if you think this act will help you evade justice, "You are mistaken. I will never tolerate arrogance, and you will pay the price for this disrespect." Henry remained silent, his cold expression that of someone who felt no threat. His act of defiance was like a declaration of war, not just against the judge, but against the entire system of justice she stood for. Though he might have felt a hint of concern deep inside, he showed no sign of it on the outside. But no one in the room could deny that Judge Vance's words were no longer a mere warning. They were a statement of power, a promise that no one, whether it was Henry Davenport or anyone else, would ever be allowed to rise above fairness. Henry's actions had ignited a fire of tension, making everyone wonder what would happen next. The story was no longer just about a courtroom confrontation. It was about a challenge to authority, honor, and the price of arrogance. The courtroom erupted after Henry Davenport's arrogant move. A wave of outrage swept through the space, amplifying the already heavy tension. Whispers and murmurs filled the air, barely concealing the anger of those present. These were not powerful figures or skilled lawyers, but the victims, those who had suffered pain and loss from Henry's immoral actions. The individuals seated behind the prosecutor, including the victims in this case, could no longer contain their emotions. A young mother, pale-faced and with eyes burning with fury, leapt to her feet, her trembling hand pointing at Henry. "You bastard!" she screamed, her voice breaking with despair. "This is why my husband is dead, why my family suffers. Does the law mean anything when this man is still allowed to sit here and disregard everything?" A collective sigh of anguish spread throughout the room. Even the families of the victims couldn't hold back their emotions. An elderly man, his eyes bloodshot from anger and grief, stood up and pointed directly at Henry. "Don't think your money and power can buy justice. We've lost loved ones, lost dreams. You won't escape forever, Davenport." The room began to rise, a wave of fury sweeping through the courtroom. Shouts and angry words echoed relentlessly, causing chaos that Judge Vance could not ignore. The room was filled with pain, frustration, and outrage. It wasn't just the people in the room, but also those watching the trial on screens who could feel the tension and indignation. Henry Davenport, though still maintaining his cold expression, began to feel the pressure. He hadn't expected such a strong reaction from the public. A sense of helplessness started creeping inside him, but he still kept his composure. He remained seated, his eyes still full of defiance, like a solitary wolf among the crowd. Judge Eleanor Vance remained unshaken. She stood tall, her eyes glowing like light cutting through the darkest night, steady as a captain in a fierce storm. Though she knew Henry Davenport's challenge could shake others, she had faced far more difficult situations in her career. The public's outrage had never caused her to lose control, and it wouldn't this time either. She lightly tapped the gavel, signaling for silence in the room. "Mr. Davenport," her voice rang out, cold yet unwavering. "Here we all abide by an unchangeable principle, respect for the law. What you are showing is not only a lack of respect for me, but for the entire legal system that you are attempting to manipulate." Henry Davenport remained seated, his face like ice, but a flicker of discomfort appeared in his eyes. Despite his confident outward appearance, Judge Vance's gaze seemed to pierce into his very mind. He couldn't help but feel a sense of losing control, as if everything he had built was slipping away at the hands of this woman. She continued, each word like a sharp blade cutting into Henry's wound. "You may use money to buy many things, but you cannot buy justice. If you wish to continue challenging this respect, you will see the price you must pay." Throughout these words, Judge Vance remained firm, allowing her reminder of the law's power to echo in the room. She knew that with this kind of arrogance, she could not allow him to escape the respect that this system demanded. Her warning was clear and decisive. Henry would have no place in this courtroom if he continued to show contempt. The feeling of outrage continued to rise within the public, seemingly impossible to contain. Those who had suffered under Henry Davenport's cruelty and injustice for years felt as though they were standing before a door about to close on them. They could no longer watch him, the man who had caused so much pain to their families, sit there disrespecting the very law and fairness they had longed for. A middle-aged woman, clutching her handkerchief tightly, her eyes filled with tears, could remain silent no longer. "Who does he think he is?" she whispered to the person next to her, her voice full of rage. "Why is he allowed to do this to all of us?" Whispers, Murmurs and angry glares began to spread across the room. The growing sense of concern about the fairness of the trial was like a dark wave drowning all trust in the system. People began to wonder if the law still had the strength to make men like Henry Davenport pay for their actions. The victims in the room, though trying to stay composed, couldn't help but feel their hearts twist with every passing moment. The price they had paid for Henry's actions was far too great. They had lost loved ones, dreams, and precious things. But now, faced with his arrogance, they were left with nothing but overwhelming frustration they couldn't fully express in that suffocating atmosphere. Judge Vance's words came like a beam of light piercing through the darkness. But would she be able to uphold justice in this room? Would the angry voices of the public be enough to awaken those in power, or would they remain silent in the face of Henry Davenport's cunning? After the initial tension, the courtroom settled into a tense silence. This time, the public's outrage no longer made anyone lose control. They were ready to hear the hard evidence, the undeniable proof of Henry Davenport's crimes. Sarah Collins, the prosecutor, stood up from her seat, her eyes sharp and full of determination. She knew this was the pivotal moment. She couldn't allow Henry's words and arrogance to deceive justice any longer. All she needed to do was bring the light, to make everyone see the truth behind the mask of this billionaire. She opened a file bag and pulled out photographs, copies of financial transactions, and audio recordings that the courtroom had been waiting for. These photographs were not glamorous images of a wealthy empire. They were irrefutable evidence of the wrongdoings Henry had committed over the years. "Your Honor, esteemed members of the court," Sarah began, her voice not too loud but convincing. "What we are about to present is not just a collection of dry numbers, but the lives that have been destroyed by the immoral actions of Mr. Henry Davenport." She placed the photographs on the table, pointing to each one, explaining in detail the wrongdoings of Henry. One photo showed luxury cars parked in front of a piece of land he had unlawfully seized. Another depicted a worker injured while working at one of Henry's factories, with no compensation or medical care as required by law. There were also copies of documents proving shady transactions and audio recordings of illegal dealings with partners, all undeniable evidence. "Mr. Davenport has exploited the weakness of laborers, stripping them of their rights and turning them into pawns in shady business deals," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "We have ample evidence that he used subsidiary companies to launder money and conceal illegal profits, all through fake contracts and clandestine payments to his partners." Each word from Sarah struck hard against the facade that Henry had carefully built. She continued to present audio recordings where Henry engaged in threatening and coercive conversations, forcing his partners to work under harsh conditions, maximizing profits without regard for human rights or the safety of workers. All of this exposed an undeniable truth. Henry Davenport had exploited every loophole in the system to illegally amass wealth while plunging thousands of people into a life without escape. Henry sat there, his face expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a slight shock as he heard the evidence. He had always been confident in his abilities, in the protection his wealth and power afforded him. But what Sarah presented made him begin to feel the weight of the threat. The entire courtroom was focused on every detail Sarah presented, and no one could deny the clarity of the evidence. Judge Vance, though still composed, could feel the weight of these revelations. She allowed no wasted time because the truth was slowly but surely being laid bare, piece by piece, as the case filled in its gaps. Sarah Collins had done something crucial. She had stripped away the true face of Henry Davenport in front of the entire community. Each piece of evidence she presented wasn't just proof of his crimes. It was a warning to all who disregarded justice that no one could escape fairness. After Prosecutor Sarah Collins presented the undeniable evidence, all eyes in the courtroom turned toward the next witnesses who would stand and testify. The victims, those who had endured the brutal and unethical actions of Henry Davenport, now decided to no longer remain silent. With courage, they stood, carrying their pain and loss, ready to provide testimonies that would shatter the powerful wall Henry had built around himself. First, Maria Hernandez, a middle-aged woman, stepped up to the witness stand. Her gaze was firm yet tinged with fear, her hands clenched tightly in front of her chest. "I worked for Mr. Davenport for 15 years," Maria began, her voice trembling but clear. I was one of the workers in his factory. We were forced to work through the night with no rest, no health insurance, and never paid fairly. When I got injured while working, not only did he not care, but he also threatened me not to file a complaint. He never cared about people, only money. Maria's voice, though fragile, brought a turning point in the courtroom. Other former workers of Henry's companies followed her, each taking the stand with their own heartbreaking stories of abuse, unfair contracts, and a complete disregard for their lives. These testimonies were not just evidence, but voices from the oppressed who had been silenced for too long. Each testimony, each story revealed more of Henry Davenport's true nature. Every witness, despite their anxiety, had the bravery to stand up and speak the truth they had lived with for years. The courtroom was no longer a battleground for lawyers alone. It became a place for truth, where the victims no longer feared speaking out. Judge Eleanor Vance remained composed and calm throughout the trial, despite the increasing tension from the testimonies and evidence presented by the prosecutor. She stood firm in her principle: justice must be served without bias. She emphasized that all evidence, all testimonies, no matter how painful, had to be considered fairly and comprehensively. She stared at Henry Davenport as he tried to discredit the witness testimonies. Mr. Davenport, these are the testimonies of those directly affected by your actions, Judge Vance said, her voice soft but powerful. I request that you do not disrupt the proceedings and respect the rights of all parties. Henry Davenport stiffened, unable to respond. He knew that any further objections would only raise more doubts about his transparency. Judge Vance held her ground, protecting the rights of the victims, ensuring that all evidence would be considered objectively. Her words were a clear declaration that in this courtroom, no one could rise above the law, no matter their power. Although Henry Davenport still sat there with his confident demeanor, the testimonies and evidence had changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. The victims, though powerless, had revealed truths they had never dared to speak before. In their eyes, the audience saw a glimmer of hope, a hope that justice would prevail, a hope that finally men like Henry would have to pay for their actions. The audience began to feel a shift in the trial. The powerful testimonies of the witnesses, combined with Prosecutor Sarah Collins's determination and Judge Eleanor Vance's fairness, began to form a picture full of hope. The feeling of helplessness against injustice began to fade. They believed that in the end, Henry Davenport would not escape his wrongdoings. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Henry Davenport began to realize he was surrounded. The room fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on him. No one could look away from the trial. He could feel the suspicion and anger from the public and the victims. Each moment that passed felt like a life-or-death struggle for him. Henry's lawyers began to act hurriedly, attempting to present weak counterarguments. But it was clear they could no longer conceal the truth. The evidence and testimonies were too powerful, leaving no room for defense. The audience in the courtroom could feel the tension rising. They knew that the battle was not over, but the revelations that had come to light made them hopeful that this time, justice would not allow Henry Davenport to escape punishment. All eyes, all minds were focused on the next developments, eagerly awaiting the final outcome. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Sarah Collins held up the documents in her hands, the light above casting a spotlight on them. Every email, every piece of financial evidence, and every audio recording she presented was a thread in the intricate web of guilt Henry Davenport had woven over the years. The room fell silent as the weight of the evidence hung in the air. Sarah began with a series of internal emails that painted a grim picture of Davenport's complete disregard for his workers' safety. She opened one email and read aloud, "We need to slash insurance costs for workers. It's the only way to maintain our margins. Don't let anyone know about this." She placed the email on the table, her eyes scanning the room with a look of unwavering determination. "This is a direct instruction from Mr. Davenport," she continued, her voice rising with intensity. "To achieve his profits, he was willing to sacrifice the lives and safety of those who worked for him. This is how he built his empire, on the backs of the vulnerable." The tension in the room was palpable as she moved on to the next piece of evidence, an audio recording of a phone call between Henry and a business partner. The recording started, and Henry's voice rang out, chillingly callous. I don't care about the benefits or company policies. Just do what you need to do to get the money in my hands. We'll deal with the legal stuff later." These words, stark and unforgiving, left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Every person in the room could feel the full weight of Henry Davenport's moral decay. This wasn't just about paperwork or transactions. This was about lives, about exploitation at the highest level. As Sarah continued to present each damning piece of evidence, the prosecution's case against Henry grew undeniably stronger. With every document, every testimony, every horrifying detail, the room drew closer to the truth. Henry Davenport had used his wealth and power to exploit the powerless, and now the curtain was being pulled back on his empire of deceit. The courtroom was charged with a silent energy as Sarah finished her presentation, and all eyes turned to the next key figure, James Thompson, a former senior executive who had worked closely with Henry Davenport for years. As James walked to the witness stand, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. He was a man who had seen the darkest sides of Henry's empire, and now, with the weight of the truth bearing down on him, he was prepared to expose it all. James took a deep breath, standing tall as he prepared to speak. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the conviction behind it. "I worked directly with Mr. Davenport for many years," he began. "I signed countless fraudulent contracts with his partners, making sure his illegal profits were hidden. I was one of the people who helped him launder money and cover up his crimes." His words struck like thunder in the room. Everyone was stunned by the admission. With each passing word, the shocking details of Henry's crimes came to light. James didn't hold back. He spoke about how Henry had not only been at the center of money laundering schemes, but also how he had actively pushed employees to work under unsafe conditions, prioritizing profit over human lives. Every time something went wrong, Henry's response was always the same: "Fix the problem, don't let it get out, keep it under wraps." The room went silent as James revealed that Henry wasn't just an absent figure behind a desk pulling strings from a distance. He was the one behind every cruel decision, every push to exploit and harm others for personal gain. James's testimony wasn't just an account of wrongdoing, it was a revelation. The well-crafted facade of Henry Davenport crumbled before the eyes of the entire courtroom. No longer could he hide behind his power, wealth, and influence. The truth was out. Henry Davenport's composure faltered as the weight of the testimony bore down on him. He sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his hands trembling as he looked around the courtroom. His eyes searched for an escape. He had always been the one in control, the one who pulled the strings from the shadows. But now, with the truth closing in on him, he realized that his empire was built on lies, and it was crumbling before him. Henry stood abruptly, his voice shaking with unease. This is all a misunderstanding," he protested, his usual confidence replaced by desperation. "I can't be held responsible for what my subordinates did. They acted on their own." But his words were weak and faltering. They lacked conviction, and the room saw through them. It was as though he knew the walls were closing in, and no amount of excuses could protect him now. The people in the courtroom could see the panic in his eyes. They could see the man who had always manipulated situations and controlled outcomes finally feeling the crushing weight of his actions. No amount of money, power, or influence could save him now. The truth was inescapable. Sarah Collins, standing firm, didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "You can no longer deny your guilt, Mr. Davenport. The evidence is irrefutable. Your time is up." As Henry's feeble defense crumbled, the victims in the courtroom could no longer hold back their fury. The pain and suffering they had endured for years bubbled to the surface. One by one, they stood, shouting in anger, their voices filled with raw emotion. "He has taken the lives of so many families," a woman screamed, her face streaked with tears. "We lost loved ones because of him. He doesn't deserve peace." The courtroom erupted with rage. The public, once silent and reserved, began to openly condemn Henry. The years of anguish, the broken lives, the shattered dreams, they could no longer be contained. The victims, the families, the people who had lost everything, this was their moment to speak. They stood together, united by their pain, as they held Henry accountable for the devastation he had caused. The atmosphere in the courtroom became chaotic. People shouted, cried, and pointed at the man who had wronged them. This was no longer a trial. It was a reckoning. The rage of the victims, fueled by years of suffering, spilled out in a tidal wave, and Henry, the man who thought he could control it all, could only sit there, powerless against the fury of those he had hurt. Judge Eleanor Vance stood, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Henry, her gaze piercing. She slammed the gavel down on the desk with authority, silencing the room. "We have witnessed testimonies and evidence that cannot be denied," she declared, her voice calm but filled with undeniable power. "We have witnessed the destruction of not only the law but also human dignity and morality. This trial is not just a legal battle. It is a battle for justice." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Justice will not tolerate men like Mr. Davenport. Respect for human life, for the law, cannot be bought, no matter how much money or power one possesses." Her voice echoed in the courtroom, a stark reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The message was clear. Henry Davenport's time had come. The victims, the witnesses, the public, they had all come together to demand justice, and now it was up to the law to deliver it. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the final verdict. The truth was clear, the evidence was undeniable, and in this courtroom, justice would prevail. The climax had arrived, and every eye in the room was fixed on the next steps, knowing that at long last, the scales of justice would tip in favor of those who had been wronged. After the overwhelming evidence, the testimonies, and the unrelenting anger from the public, the courtroom descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. It felt as though the very air had been drawn out, leaving everyone in a tense, suspended moment. All eyes were fixed on the judge, waiting for the final word. Judge Eleanor Vance stood, her gaze never leaving Henry Davenport, her posture as unyielding as the law she upheld. Her voice, when it came, was cold and decisive, cutting through the room with precision. "The court is adjourned. The jury will need time to deliberate," she stated, her tone resolute and final. "We will resume tomorrow." The words hit the room like a bucket of cold water, dousing the flames of hope that had burned so brightly moments before. For those who had suffered at the hands of Henry Davenport, the promise of justice felt within reach. But now, it was pushed further away, leaving them with only uncertainty. The victims sat in the courtroom, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and disappointment. The emotional weight of the trial seemed to settle deeper in their hearts as they realized they would have to wait even longer for a final decision. Henry Davenport, though cornered by damning evidence and powerful testimonies, found momentary relief. He sat there motionless for a brief second before his lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smirk. He hadn't lost yet. The delay was his lifeline, a chance to exploit the system one last time. Despite the mounting pressure against him, he knew the law's delays were his opportunities. The possibility of appeals, the power of his wealth and influence, they all remained at his disposal. In his mind, this wasn't the end. This was just another battle in a longer war. He still had the tools to stretch this trial, to push the inevitable further into the future. He knew that as long as he could keep the system in motion, he could still shift the tide. The audience, who had so strongly supported justice, now found themselves weighed down with a sense of deep disappointment and helplessness. A creeping anxiety began to spread through the room as they realized that despite the relentless push for justice, it could not be achieved immediately. The mounting evidence, the testimonies, and the public's palpable outrage had all been so clear, yet they were forced to face a brutal truth. Henry Davenport, the wealthy and powerful man at the center of it all, still had an opportunity to escape. The victims silently made their way out of the courtroom, their faces etched with pain. For years, they had fought tirelessly to reclaim justice, but now they were left with nothing but the excruciating weight for another day. The weight of helplessness enveloped them, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The bitter reality was that despite their perseverance, they had no control over the outcome. Money and power, it seemed, could still alter the course of a trial, and it felt as though people like Henry never had to truly pay for their crimes. The frustration in the air was suffocating. The victims, now resigned to their fate, couldn't help but feel the overwhelming weight of the system, its potential for injustice, its tendency to favor the powerful. They had come so close to seeing the truth revealed, yet they now faced a painful pause. It was as if the legal process itself, with its intricacies and delays, was yet another tool for those like Henry Davenport to exploit, allowing him to delay, manipulate, and possibly evade accountability altogether. The false hope that had risen with the previous day's revelations began to wither, replaced by a growing sense of defeat as the atmosphere thickened with disappointment. The door to any hope seemed to close. But just as the silence became suffocating, a sudden disruption occurred. Henry Davenport's lawyer stood up, his demeanor exuding an unsettling confidence. He held a thick stack of documents, a pile that no one in the courtroom had seen before. "Your Honor, I request to present new evidence," the lawyer declared, his voice full of assurance. "These documents have not been made public before and will change everything we've witnessed thus far." A sudden shift swept through the room. Every eye turned to the stack of documents, now a focal point of growing tension. The witnesses, the prosecutors, and even the public leaned forward in their seats, their faces filled with curiosity. No one knew what to expect, but the room hummed with the electric anticipation of something significant. The lawyer opened the documents and pointed to a page. "This is an important legal document proving that Mr. Davenport's transactions were completely lawful. We have full evidence showing that the financial transactions that were alleged to be illegal were in fact executed under the guidance of top financial experts, and there was no violation whatsoever." The revelation sent shock waves through the room. The room fell into stunned silence as the lawyer's words hit like a thunderclap, causing confusion and disbelief to ripple through the audience. What had once seemed like a straightforward case now appeared to be mired in ambiguity. The courtroom, previously filled with a sense of certainty about Henry's guilt, was now engulfed in an unsettling wave of doubt. Everyone from the judge to the witnesses was caught off guard. What had appeared to be a slam dunk for the prosecution was suddenly clouded by this new evidence. The confidence that had been building up was quickly replaced by profound uncertainty. Was this new evidence truly a game changer, or was it a desperate attempt by Henry's legal team to derail the proceedings? The room was filled with questions, and the weight of the trial seemed heavier than ever. The certainty of the trial's course had been shaken, and no one knew what would come next in this increasingly unpredictable battle for justice. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, as if time itself had frozen. The audience exchanged anxious glances, struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Those who had placed their faith in justice now felt that faith beginning to falter. They couldn't understand where this new evidence had come from and whether it held the power to completely alter the course of the trial. Henry Davenport, despite maintaining his calm exterior, knew in that moment that he had an opportunity. He surveyed the courtroom, recognizing that this reversal could change everything. The hopes of the public, the victims, could now seem like an illusion, easily twisted by the very power and wealth he wielded. The fear was palpable. His money and influence had always afforded him a level of protection, and now it seemed that those very things might be enough to manipulate the truth, bend the law, and escape accountability once again. Henry sat there, his thoughts racing, realizing that what had felt like an inevitable defeat was now suddenly a chance for victory. His confidence, once shaken by the mounting evidence and testimonies, was reignited. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where money, influence, and the carefully placed power he had built over the years might just tip the scales in his favor. The room remained heavy with tension as the realization began to settle over the audience. The line between justice and power was not as clear-cut as they had hoped. They had believed that truth would be enough to bring Henry to account, but now they were unsure. The atmosphere, once filled with hope, now crackled with uncertainty. As the courtroom lingered in tense silence, a great question loomed over everyone in the room, a question that weighed heavily on the minds of all those present. Can justice be bought? Can the truth, the honest testimonies, and evidence overcome the immense power of wealth and influence? This trial was no longer simply a clash between two opposing sides. It had transformed into a battle for the very existence of justice in a society where money and power seemed to control everything. The stakes were no longer about winning or losing. They were about the survival of fairness itself. The struggle had transcended the courtroom. It had become a question of what kind of society they lived in, a society where the powerful could manipulate, twist, and distort the truth to protect their own interests. The audience, who had hoped to see justice prevail, now found themselves in a state of deep confusion. The firm belief that truth would conquer all seemed fragile, shattered by the realization that Henry's wealth could still tip the scales. They no longer felt certain of the outcome. Would they witness a man who had caused so much harm be held accountable? Or would they watch as a wealthy tycoon continued to manipulate the legal system to his advantage, escaping the consequences of his actions once again? The answer would be determined in the days to come, but for now, an overwhelming sense of unease and doubt hung over the room. The very essence of justice was being questioned, and the audience was left wondering whether it would truly prevail. As the trial continued, the shadows of power loomed larger, casting doubt over what seemed to be a righteous cause. The struggle for justice had never seemed more fragile, and the outcome more uncertain. The shock wave caused by Henry Davenport's lawyer presenting new evidence reverberated through the courtroom, leaving a heavy, intense silence in its wake. However, Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman of unwavering resolve, refused to let the events shake her determination. She understood the gravity of the situation. In a trial of this magnitude, no ambiguity or falsehood could be allowed to sway the course of justice. Without hesitation, Judge Vance called for an independent investigation to verify the authenticity of the new evidence. She knew that the reputation she had built over the years in her career would not allow for any compromises when it came to truth and integrity. With the assistance of legal experts and independent auditors, she began a meticulous examination of the documents that Henry's lawyer had introduced. Judge Vance was not one to rush. She spent hours poring over the evidence, scrutinizing every detail, from signatures to financial transactions. She made sure each aspect was inspected thoroughly, ensuring full transparency and fairness. She knew that in a case like this, the smallest oversight could mean the difference between upholding justice and letting an unjust lie slip through the cracks. As the investigation unfolded, she began to uncover discrepancies, shady details, errors that were impossible to explain away. The documents, upon closer inspection, revealed clear signs of tampering. There were inconsistencies in the dates, signatures that didn't match, and financial figures that didn't align with the records from the company. It became apparent that the new evidence was not what it claimed to be. It was a carefully constructed forgery. Judge Vance's sharp eyes did not miss these signs. She had built a career on the foundation of truth and fairness, and she would not allow deceit to subvert the course of justice. The legal experts she had consulted confirmed her suspicions, revealing that the new evidence was not only flawed but intentionally manipulated to mislead the court. The room, once filled with uncertainty, began to settle into the clarity of truth. The careful investigation conducted by Judge Vance had exposed the falsehoods that Henry's defense team had tried to plant. She would not allow the legal system to be used as a tool for further deception. The wheels of justice were turning once again, and they were turning in the right direction. Henry Davenport's attempt to manipulate the trial had failed, but Judge Vance knew this was only one victory in a larger battle. The real test of justice was yet to come. When the results of the investigation were revealed, the courtroom was stunned into silence. Judge Eleanor Vance had not only clarified the issues surrounding the new evidence, but had also uncovered a dark conspiracy behind it all. The documents presented by Henry Davenport's lawyer were fraudulent. After thorough examination and analysis by legal experts, it was confirmed that the signatures and markings in the documents did not conform to the required legal standards. This proved that Henry and his defense team had intentionally forged evidence to deceive the courtroom, intending to delay the trial and postpone its conclusion. It was a calculated strategy of deception to avoid confronting the truth. The courtroom erupted in disbelief as the once trusted evidence was shattered, revealing the truth in its full, unforgiving light. Henry Davenport and his team could no longer escape the watchful eye of justice. The audience, the victims, and even the witnesses had placed their faith in these documents, believing them to be the key to his defense. But now they stood exposed as fabrications designed to mislead the court. The walls built by Henry's power and deceit began to crumble, and for the first time in this trial, the overwhelming force of truth could be felt in the air. The battle for justice was far from over. but it had received a crucial victory. With all the newly revealed evidence, the truth was undeniable. The jury no longer harbored any doubts about Henry Davenport's guilt. His actions, from deceiving the public to committing fraud to abusing his power to amass wealth at the expense of others, had been laid bare for all to see. There was no escape for him now. The jury delivered their verdict. Henry Davenport is guilty. He must be held accountable under the law. Each word of the verdict rang out like thunder in the courtroom, reverberating in the hearts of everyone present, especially the victims. They stood, tears streaming down their faces, as they felt the weight of a lifelong struggle finally give way to a bittersweet victory. They had lost so much, but in this moment, they regained a piece of what they had lost: justice. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they could finally feel that all their pain and suffering had been worth something. Justice had been served. The room, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt lighter. The battle had been long, and the cost had been high, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. The verdict was not just a legal victory. It was a triumph for all those who had suffered, for all those who had stood up against the system, and for all those who believed in the power of justice. The audience in the courtroom began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Those who had doubted whether justice could truly prevail now felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The fear that power and wealth could bend the law had been extinguished, at least for now. The overwhelming tension, anxiety, and helplessness that had clouded the room for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound trust in the legal system. The victims, despite the unbearable pain they had endured, now felt a sense of validation. Their fight, though long and arduous, had not been in vain. They had stood tall and refused to give up, and in this moment, they were rewarded. Justice had finally sided with them. The feeling was indescribable. The room erupted into applause, not just for the verdict, but for witnessing the victory of truth, justice, and the belief in a legal system that could not be corrupted by power. The cheers weren't only for the punishment of a guilty man, but for the restoration of hope. The truth had triumphed over deceit, and the law had stood firm against those who sought to manipulate it for their own gain. This moment, this victory, would be remembered not just as a courtroom triumph, but as a testament to the resilience of those who fight for what is right. Though Henry Davenport had been convicted and justice had won, no one could deny that the battle was not yet fully over. Henry still had the right to appeal, and the ongoing fight for true accountability was not yet complete. This victory was important, but it was only a part of a longer struggle. Nonetheless, the trust in Henry's power had been shattered. No longer could he be seen as an untouchable figure, the embodiment of wealth and influence. He was now merely a man who had used his power to escape the consequences of his actions for far too long. Now the system had caught up with him, and the full force of the law was upon him. While justice may not be perfect, it was a step in the right direction, and it had been achieved. The public, the victims, and everyone in the courtroom who had stood by the truth knew that while there were still challenges ahead, the law would ultimately prevail. The power of those like Henry Davenport could no longer overshadow the truth. Though the fight was not over, the message was clear: justice, when fought for with unwavering resolve, would always find a way to rise. This trial was not just a legal battle between two sides. It was a testament to the power of justice. It had a profound impact on the public, raising awareness about fairness and the responsibility of each individual to society. The stories of the victims, those who stood up against injustice, awakened empathy and garnered strong support from everyone. The public was no longer just passive observers. They understood that each of us has a duty to protect justice, to fight against unfairness, regardless of whether someone holds power or not. This trial sparked in everyone a belief that we can change this world, one small step, one right action at a time. The final message that the trial conveyed was clear and powerful: no one is above the law. Whether wealthy, powerful, or influential, all must be held accountable to justice. Justice, though it may be tested, will always prevail in the end. Nothing can hide the truth, and no one can escape fairness when it is enforced. This event reaffirmed the belief that in any circumstance, justice will always speak up, protect the oppressed, and prevent injustice from thriving. It serves as a reminder to all of us that no matter the challenges, the fight for justice is never in vain. The story of Henry Davenport and Judge Eleanor Vance didn't end in the courtroom. It will continue to resonate in the hearts of all, serving as an endless source of inspiration for those who believe in the power of justice and truth. This story will be mentioned in conversations, in lessons about ethics and justice, reminding us of the importance of standing up against injustice. Although Henry Davenport may still appeal, the public's faith in him has completely vanished. He will no longer be seen as a symbol of power or success, but as a reminder of the cost of abusing power and wealth to harm others. This story will never be forgotten, for it is proof of the strength of truth, justice, and the belief in our ability to change the world, one action at a time. Thank you so much for joining us on this emotional journey. Your time and attention mean the world to us, and we hope this story has inspired you to stand up for justice, fairness, and the truth. The fight for justice never ends, and together, we can make a difference. If you believe in the power of stories that touch hearts and change perspectives, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us on this journey to spread awareness, inspire change, and never stop fighting for what is right. Stay tuned for more powerful stories. Thank you for being a part of this incredible community.